So welcome, friends. This is a truth and reconciliation workshop with our facilitators. And we've also invited members of the Shakti Fellowship. We have 51 women from 13 countries who are part of the Shakti Fellowship. Some of them are here. And I've also invited members of the Chausat Yogini Facebook group. So some may be from there as well. So I lose count of how many truth and reconciliation workshop facilitators we have currently, but it's a good 60 odd number, if I'm not mistaken. And the background to the Truth and Reconciliation work is that we launched with a weekend on the 4th and 5th of July last year. This was to mark the uprising after George Floyd's death. So 4th of July was to mark that, the American Independence Day. 5th of July was Guru Purnima in India. So it was also about getting in touch with the Guru Shakti, the wisdom that's needed to move through all the truth and reconciliation that needs to happen across our cultures, across our societies, across generations. And there are two broad themes that the Truth and Reconciliation movement is looking to lead and address. One is to heal the past, the wounds and the trauma of the past. And the other is to lead the future, the good future that is needed if this planet is going to survive and if humanity is going to survive. So we had some amazing facilitators, and they come and offer us workshops every month. And this month we are lucky we have two. On the 6th of April, we had Jeremy Solomons joined by his colleague Maurice from Rwanda to mark the Kigali Genocide Memorial Day. And it was pretty awesome what they shared on the 6th of April. And so today on the 12th of April, we have Raghu. He's also joined by Preeti, and if I'm not mistaken, Suki is going to join as well, perhaps. But Raghu and Preeti and Suki and many of you here perhaps took forward one theme around truth and reconciliation, as in what was it that's needed in India, given our own history and our own trauma of being colonized and having this caste system and our interreligious troubles and so on. So Raghu took that forward, and we were just chatting informally some days ago, and he said something very, very interesting has flowered out of that initial event that they held at the weekend. And so I said, why don't you come and show us what's come up? What have you created? It's a framework for dialogue, and it can apply to all cultures, but I think it has been anchored in the Indian culture, and specifically around what it means to be a Hindu at this time and what are the challenges of that. So with that, over to you, Raghu, and take it from here. Please add any further overview you wish to add, and introduce anyone else who's going to be doing this with you.
Yeah, it's raining in the background, huh? So you have a bit of noise. Is it
Nice.
disturbing, or is that okay?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Suki is not well today, Nilima, but we have quite a few people who are part of our team. Preeti and I will share the space, and whoever else from our group who wants to will share, right? And we'll keep this fairly informal. Yeah, one, because formal presentations scare me. Yeah. And the other, because I think what we've got is still work in progress. And I think, I was just counting, we must have met at least 20 times or so, 3 hours and odd, so 600 hours, and we are still in work in progress mode. Yeah. So it's kind of, it's taken us into a fair amount of depth in looking at this issue. And Preeti and I were just talking about this, na? That dealing with trauma and even just issues of identity at a community belonging level are so difficult to look at, because there are so many things, there's so much of complexity in it, right? Many of us in the group are have been working with process work, identity group work, and so on. And what struck me when I was looking back is that when we get into these groups, we seem to work very easily with individual trauma. Yeah, we work fairly okay with saying this is what happened in my family, this is how my mother or my father screwed me up and all this kind of stuff. And then we jump into work talking about what happens in the organization or something, right? The middle ground where there's so much of our identity which is drawn from what we belong to, and our tradition seems to get left out. So here we've been looking primarily at this, and it's a whole very complex thing. So I'll just share with you what we have been working on, and like I said, it's work in progress. Yeah. Yeah, can you see the slide? Okay. Now, the first thing that we should keep in mind is that even this idea, difficulty of being a Hindu, came up in the middle of the dialogue. When we were talking about things, we kind of said, this is not an easy thing at all. And I'll just go into why and things like that. We'll just give a small background. We'll start with saying thanks to you, Nilima. You got Preeti and me together and getting into this. And we very quickly said, yeah, let's do something. We organized, I think, a 90-minute or a 2-hour dialogue to start with, after some discussion with Suki and a few of us. And as we went into that dialogue, I think we had 2 of them, if I remember right. As we went into it, we discovered that this is not something that's going to be easy to discuss. It's not something where you say, breathe and quieten yourself and all will be well. It's much, much more complex than that, right? So we formed a group which we call a kudam. A kudam is an Indian term for a dialoguing group, which has got a lot of, it's a democratic kind of a setup. So we've been having these dialogues over a period of time, and there are lots of peculiarities which came up when we were looking at the whole thing. See, one of the things that is important to keep in mind is India is a half-baked country, right? And if any of you have read Frantz Fanon, he speaks about this very clearly, that we are not a fully liberated country. So what that means is that the colonized mind is still very operative, and a lot of us who are educated Indians and so on are in a very peculiar halfway house, right? And this halfway house is that we are partly liberated from the actual impact of colonization with the British rule in India as it was, but we still rule from the same buildings, we still rule from this with the same laws. And there are so many ways in which we are just replicating the colonized process. So it's a very difficult thing to negotiate, right? I don't know if we were completely colonized, what it would have been like, or if we are completely the colonizer, what it will be like. We're not too sure, but this is where we are. So we also find that in this space, there are broadly three kinds of very, very broad categories of reality. One is that there is a very interesting idea in the Indian tradition, which is called Apad Dharma, which says when you're in great difficulty, when your life might be in danger and so on, it's okay to kind of, say this, quietly pretend to the other as though you're doing whatever they want, go back and do what you want to do, and don't push too hard, because if you push too hard, you're probably going to get killed. Yeah. And after a couple of 100 years or more, or maybe 500 years or 400 years of doing this, a lot of what you see in India as culture, yeah, is actually this form of distorted culture, which is neither a clear assertion of who we are, nor can we give up. So it's a kind of it's a strange mix. So in this, some of us are struggling with trying to find out, discover what it really means to be Indian, to be Hindu, and so on. And, some people are hurting, some people are reacting. It's a mixed bag. And we believe that the only way forward in a context like this is to understand dialogue. How does one dialogue? Because there's no such thing as a monolith Hindu. There's no such thing as a monolithic Indian. And the other thing that I think we all discovered while we were going through this is any person who takes their identity at a belonging level seriously probably is going to look at and have to look at all these issues that we've been grappling with. Yeah, so we thought we'll just share this with you and look at what are the possibilities of dialogue, what might be the ways going forward, and so on. Right? So we ended up with, looking at number of voices and how we were speaking and what each of us were coming up with. Yeah, and we then put it together in some kind of a framework because we needed a container to have a dialogue. Otherwise, one person would speak about something and the other person would speak about something else, and they were coming from very different spaces.
Raghu?
So once we put this together, it became a lot easier to
Raghu?
Yeah.
Raghu, could you go on full screen? There's people are unable to read on the screen. If you could go on full screen, it would be easier.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, I was wondering why it was looking slightly funny on my screen. Is this better now?
Yes.
Yeah. So, the first obvious thing we got into when we looked at this was what has happened to us, what is our location as a colonized person, and so on. So there was a very strong, clear identification with having been through trauma as a colonized country. Yeah. And there was both. There was a lot of rage with unresolved trauma, there was denial, there was amnesia, and all of that. So we looked at it and we said there are two broad ends we can look at as the anchors of where we are coming from. One is the rage that comes with realizing that we are hurt. The other, very interestingly, is to look at the hurt, and the response is great deal of compassion. for not only oneself, but for all the hurt people in the world. Yeah. And the other axis that we looked at was, are we looking at this whole thing from respect or from disrespect? Are we looking at it from pride, or are we looking at it from contempt, arrogance? What is the other dimension? Right now, when you put these two together, we get a very interesting dynamic. There are so 4 locations that we explored. We'll go through it a little quickly today because we've taken hours and hours over looking at each of them, and I still don't think we're ready with something complete. I don't think we ever will be. So I don't think that's a big problem. So we looked at these 4. We said, what happens when a person, let's say I am still stuck in the shame of the experience, shame of being Indian. And there's a whole lot of this that you find, I guess, amongst all colonized people, but definitely in India, among Hindus, there's a lot of shame of being Hindu, right? And there is a certain rage around this. So what happens when that's the space you're looking at yourself from? And one of the things that came through to us was there was a lot of envy that one is sitting in when you're in this space. And this envy has been, we've seen it happen, work through in so many ways. I think work through is a wrong statement. Act out, right? I think personally that the last 65, 70 years, we've ruled ourselves with an envy of the West. And right now, I think we're ruling ourselves with an envy of the East. So we haven't yet discovered where to anchor ourselves from. And we also think that a lot of flight of good people away from India is because of this envy. We're going all over the place, largely to America. Yeah. And there are processes that get unleashed on the self and others when you're in this location. So we looked at that. And we also looked at the fact that it's not just all negatives out here. The ability to own up the shame and ability to own up the anger is also has positive possibilities. So what is the functionality of this? So we said that if you really look at this carefully, there's also an acute sensitivity to all that is negative in the culture. Yeah. And the dysfunction, of course, is not being able to look at this carefully, but get into either desperate attempts to become somebody else, or to say, like so many so-called reformers in India have done, to come back and say, you know what, we should restate who we are in Western terms. So there have been lots of attempts to restate Hinduism in Abrahamic terms, a lot of attempts to define India based on Orientalist frameworks and so on. So we looked at that. Yeah. And then we looked at the other side of the pendulum, in a sense, that when you look at yourself with pride, it often goes into arrogance. And arrogance and this rage is a deadly combination. So there's a tremendous impulse, drive to say, let's reclaim our lost glory. So you'll find a lot of literature going on today from some sections saying we have to become the Vishwa Gurus again. Right? Lots of stuff like this. And here, there seems to be a tendency to get caught with the othering in ways that it's almost like we have internalized the oppressor and we like to oppress back again. Kind of a context we've gotten into. Right? But there's also a positive to this in that there is an attempt to reinvest, to study, to understand what's happening when both the Raudra aspect, the anger and the reactivity is kind of little manageable and you don't get into arrogance and you're looking at things with pride, you can actually start looking at things again and say, what is it that is meaningful in the tradition? Yeah. And of course, there's a whole lot of chest beating, there's a whole lot of glorification. All of this is going on. So if we look at much of the writing that's happened in recent times, even current stuff that goes on in the television, you'll find that all of this is getting played out, right? And then there are other voices also, right? Where if I place myself in the space of compassion and at the same time looking at the shame of who I am and what we have become. Because at one level, I mean, it's very difficult that we have a history that goes back 5,000, 10,000 years, which has been very, very powerful, very meaningful till almost 800 years back. And today, we are a country which has been driven to penury. So how does one reconcile this, right? How does one look at this reality with compassion? And most people who comment about India as it is, yeah, looking at the caste system and so on, don't seem to understand this reality. And therefore, they don't look at it from the eye of compassion. And they don't seem to understand how desperate things become when you're driven to penury, not even poverty. And then what happens to groups and how they deal with each other, because there's so little left and you're just grabbing whatever there is, right? It's pretty sad. And it's in spite of this, when I've done work on the ground, we have found fantastic examples of how in villages people come together. In fact, the idea of the kudam came from when I was working in villages, where people from different communities come together for water, for agricultural practices and things like that, which are all traditional practices, which have a huge amount of democracy in it, a lot of dialogue, a lot of consensus building, and so on, right? Now, fundamentally, what happens here also seems to be, very squarely what Franz Fanon talked about. A lot of blackface, white mask kind of syndromes, uh, trying very hard to whiten your skin. The biggest industry in India today is whitening cream. All kinds of sad things going on here. But at the same time, there's also a possibility of catharsis and healing. Because without owning up to where one is and owning up to the hurt and the shame, you cannot move out of it. Yeah. And I think a lot of Indians, a lot of us are caught with a certain sense of resignation too. Yeah. And we have a lot of colloquial statements which say this is how it happens in India. It happens like this only, and statements like that. Yeah. So then there is the other possibility of voicing and healing. Yeah. There's a possibility of being located in pride, owning up to the hurt in ways that make sense. Yeah. And learning how to regenerate from where we are, rather than get caught with one or the other of the reactive spaces. Yeah. But there's also a strong tendency to explain away negatives. Yeah. So we very easily get caught with things like, yeah, we're a very great people, we are so spiritually evolved, and buy into this thing that we, in practical terms, we're not very interested, which I don't think is true at all. Because when you really study the Hindu texts, and when you study the whole process, the amount of work we've done in mathematics and physics and chemistry and in architecture and so many things which have to do with what we call artha and kama, with wealth building and aspirational aspects, is huge. So there's a whole complex reality that came out through our dialogues. Yeah. So I'll stop here and have Preeti and other people add what happened to us when we were looking at this and so on.
Thanks, Raghu. I continue to marvel at the brilliance of this work, and I also value the fact that it's still emerging, as it naturally should. What comes up for me is, Nilima, when you got us all started on TRW, is you allowed for a conversation that was potentially long pending, and a conversation with ourselves. And that was to contextualize trauma. For the most part, we've spoken of trauma as a distant thing that happens to others, and how do we step into support. But here was an opportunity to actually say, what about me? What happens in my life? What has happened in my lineage? What about my story? What about my culture? What about my tradition? And the brilliance of this work, of this emergent work, is specifically to the context of Hinduism and colonization, which somewhere, unfortunately, has become uh, a jumble, a mess. Yeah, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to pause there for the fact that, you know, it's important for us to be able to speak to what we've lost, because that's what we are clinging to. I know I most certainly am. It's a process of emergence for me as I work through this. But over to Ratish, Hari, Ria, who've been on these calls and in these conversations.
Uh, Hi, this is Ratish. I could go next, and I'm sure the others have a lot to add as well. I think one of my, I mean, again, it's been an amazing experience seeing this unravel, and every time we come back to it, we, I think, unfold more nuances, and we've had an entire session on one word. Like I think we spoke for 2 hours on scarcity a few weeks ago, and that's sort of the level of depth I think that we're still discovering in terms of what we are discussing. For me, one of the most important learnings as we went through this process was also that while we call this the difficulty of being Hindu, and there is a lot about the context in which we are discussing it, the framework itself is very transferable for any discussion on identity that we hold true to ourselves and can apply. And it sort of becomes an effective way to look at a lot of the conflicts in identity that I think we carry, and personally I carry internally, which I thought was a revelation for me in terms of how we apply it. And then as I continue to do my work as part of my professional career, and a lot of times I fell back on some of the conversations here as a way of making meaning out of what I was going through there and what I was noticing, which I thought was extremely powerful. And I think, secondly, it was also for me very interesting to see how I and a lot of people in the group reacted to the identity conversation, where I think in the first few sessions there was a lot of views which were primarily a binary conversation, which is, oh, I can't call myself a Hindu because that sort of diminishes all the other identities I carry. And so it took us a little while to understand that we are, as Morga, more of a wide range of identities that we carry, and in some sense they all coexist. Itself was, I think, a moment of penny dropping and realization for a lot of us in the group, which I think was another important learning and revelation for me as well as we went through this process.
Yeah, I'll go next. I mean, for me, of course, the conversation on not a monolithic way of looking at this identity, but also then finding what Raghu said in the beginning, right? Like the pendulum swung from really extremely personal to sort of organizational, etc. And And in its absence, it was very present. The discussion around groups or tribes, this othering and so on. And I mean, I know I, for one, found myself again and again coming to, therefore, what is truth? And how do I reconcile with the many truths that are there? Like, to start from the conversation sort of, began from there. That when I talk about identity, I mean, I'm born in a Christian family, right? So this question of identity and who do I belong and where do I belong, and is it a function of cause and effect? And moving from this and not getting stuck, I think as we were going through this, to see where it was dense. And I think the brilliant thing about this is to see the all the other things, but not get stuck, to see the functional side of it and the dysfunctional side of it, allowed in a way to have different lenses into the dialogue and then come from there. I mean, it is, of course, I'm just about understanding it as well. But even dialogue is not a singular entry exit point, right? That has been, that's been where I am.
And if I can add, for me, the biggest aha moment when we worked through this was looking at ourselves both as being the oppressed as well as the oppressor, because it is not, it's cyclical in a way, and it's also in different contexts we assume the different roles unconsciously. So going through that entire process as to what is it we have lost as being the oppressed, as well as what are we influencing and what can we influence as having had the privilege in some of the spaces. That was a very, very interesting conversation.
I also want to add one thing, is to come to this not from a place of certainty and not from a place of questions, and I think what was very present for me as we are doing this is questions different from inquiry. Not needing answers. Questions will need answers. They may or may not have answers. Inquiry just opens up the exploration, right? But just that distinction, is it like that, is not a question somebody is asking. Because in the response, if you see it as a question, the dialogue ends. But as an inquiry, it opens from both sides, that what is this inquiry generating inside of me, therefore? Which location?
I'll go next. So I think for me, this dialogue process has been a very personal and powerful experience. Also partly due to the kind of family history I have. I think the biggest learning and for me from this exploration was of how I could see myself traverse all these different spaces, which oftentimes I was not aware of. And there was also a lot of judgment of being in a particular space without really also looking at there is a functionality or there is a gift of that space also. So I think the exploration really helped me to one, look at where I am and what's the price I'm paying for that location. And also at the same time, not to completely disregard it, but at the same time, look at what other possibilities are there in looking at myself and the hurt and the pain or the trauma that I feel evoked in these explorations. So I think that has been a significant healing space for me.
As we worked together, the other thing that came up with this whole idea of, and this is a formal trauma trauma studies curriculum perspective, is this idea of resources. And we sat and spoke about this for a bit, is to say that every culture, every tradition, every family system, potentially every country, uh, every individual, every organization has a container of resources that are cultivated through what that tradition offers us over time. Now, the understanding is that it is actively and organically built when we are children. Our ability to deal with even what we're doing right now, this is an ability. These are resources. Are we able to spiral gradually into ourselves through this lens of inquiry so that we can understand ourselves differently? And those are the resources that we look to build. That is somewhat where it starts, and that's somewhat where we want to go. We want to be able to be seated within our bodies, to be able to actually explore ourselves fully. And trauma becomes an impediment to that. So, in effect, this entire exercise, and as it continues to be, is also a resource building exercise, is building our resources, building our muscle to go deeper into ourselves. Raghu?
Yeah. Now we'll also look at the other end, because as we went in and Ratish and other people mentioned it, we also looked at the flip side. So we'll come to that, but maybe we'll spend a little time. If there are any questions about this framework and what we've done and so on, we can answer that.
This is Nilima, just to kind of bridge this to many of our participants who are not from India. Just to remind everyone, the Karuna axis on the top is compassion. The below Raudra is anger. Apaman on the left is shame or humiliation. And Abhiman on the right is pride. And so first of all, I mean, I can just imagine how many hours did you say you've been meeting?
600 into approximately 10 people at a time, so 6,000 person hours.
That's incredible. And this is like the elixir, isn't it? This one.
Not yet. This is still
okay, great.
This is still part of the mantram.
No, so but obviously to have come to this part, to this place, is definitely one of the many jewels that came out of the manthan. I understand function and dysfunction. That's very easy. In the same way, can you just quickly explain what you mean by nature and process? How do those two complement each other? Or just like function and dysfunction is easy to understand. What is captured in nature versus process?
Yeah, see, any human process, in a sense, has all these four. If I'm in an organization, there is the nature of that organization. What does the way of doing things in that organization, how does it do this? So it's broadly, the culture of that particular space might be an extension of the idea. But yeah, if you put yourself into this space, now let's say you put yourself into compassion and experiencing shame. The nature of that space is victimhood and a great inability to voice oneself. Because I'm drawn into sadness, I'm drawn into deep despair, I'm drawn into self-defeat and so many things. It's very, very difficult for me to articulate anything from here. Right? And then what is the process that's going on in me once I'm caught there? Right? So that's what we try to explore in this.
Okay.
So adding to that question, I want to know, is this, my name is Rashi or Megan. So, and I'm an actress, so this is difficult for me, but I just feel that I'm part of all of this. So I'm here. I want to know, this is an individual, like I'm looking at it as an individual, but when you're talking about organization or sect or a particular community, no, I just want to have clarity on that.
No, this is an individual. I am simultaneously in all four. I might own up one more than the other. So as a colonized person, the easiest thing to own up is self-hate and envy of the other.
Or
Right?
I could always be in a flux, like
Or
minute, hour to hour.
if you're in a
Because
flux,
that's how I feel right now.
that's a very good start if you're in flux, because then dialogue becomes possible. If you're not in flux, people tend to get stuck in one or the other space. And then there is a whole lot of dynamics that happens and dialogue becomes impossible. If dialogue is not possible, healing is not possible. So the attempt was then for each of us to go in and say, which part of me am I holding in self-hate, for example, as being a Hindu? Yeah. And which part of me am I getting caught with where I'm so angry with what has happened to me that I just rant and rage against the colonizer? Right?
So
And
it's
then
also
if I'm
like
caught with this or the other, then the way I will look at so many things changes very, very, yeah. The
so it's
drastic
like
difference.
basically the operating principle, like something on which, through which we behave, or like we perceive, we behave, and we operate from. I mean, like I was a theater activist, now I'm a seeker and a healer. So you know, the whole transition of going through all of that. But these 4 points are basically a framework for us to kind of understand where I am right now, from where I'm operating in this moment or this circumstance or with
Correct.
this group of people.
Correct. Now, as a theater person, I also do a lot of work with theater, and this comes from theater, right? So you go into the space of envy of the other and play it out. What's the dialogue? How do you look at the other? How do you respond to each other? How do you respond to your own kind? Right? And then you get out of that skin, you wear a different mask, you go into this other space of this guy who's saying, you know what, we're the greatest ever.
I know.
That
When
fully,
I was
right?
studying theater in America, I was in purple all the time.
Right. So you explore this fully, and then you go to the other space where you're inside this goddamn cave and you don't know what to do with yourself. Right. And so on. So you really, yeah, that's the way I would see this playing out. If I was to do a workshop and there's no COVID around, it would be full of theater.
Thank you so much.
Rashi, it would also be fair to say that all 4 boxes are appropriate in the making of this journey, and we potentially transit from one to the other. And it also has embedded really deeply in it a spiral which can go upward and downward.
And I actually saw that. I had the whole energy reading of it going like this, and you know, like in the group of people, like sometime it's radiating in different people in different ways, but it was moving so fast, and that's why I was thinking, am I in flux all the time, or this is what it symbolizes? So it's great to get that insight. Thank you, Preeti.
Yeah, we're giving you about 6,000 person hours of work in 15 minutes. No wonder you feel like this, no? We actually spent hours on each quadrant, and like Ratish was saying, sometimes on each word, yeah? And what would it really mean? So, yeah.
Raghu,
And once we were able to get into this framework, it became easier to discuss, because when one person's, let's say, talking from self-hate, yeah, location, it's very, very difficult for everybody to listen quietly, because maybe there are other people there who cannot handle this. So just understanding that there are different locations and all of us being there with compassion allowed dialogue to take place. And then all of us move into another space. Look at that, examine this, examine each of them. And then we can sit back and say, what am I a combination of? Yeah, like Hari didn't mention this, nah? He comes from, uh, uh, his forefathers were kings. So being impoverished has a certain meaning for him. For me, it's the opposite. My grandfather came from penury. My wife's grandfather came from a place where there was famine. My grandfather came from a place where there was famine. And they made their lives into something quite creditable from where they were. So each of us here has a personal history, carry a personal family history, which is unique. And I don't know of any family in India which cannot go back even one generation and touch deep pain and deep trauma. Yeah, I've dealt with families in Jaipur, which still hold this Khandani, which still hold which still have their little palaces. It's extremely sad to see who they are and what they have become and what they might have been. Right? And when you see them today, and you see how oppressive they are to themselves and to other people, right? If you have if you look at it from a little further back, you see how they've internalized the oppressor. And then they hold it as their own identity, which is terrible. They cannot see how they've internalized the oppressor. And they will talk about their own glory and completely blind to who they are. Because I don't think loss of glory is something easy to handle.
And that's a really good point, Raghu, because the definition of trauma is also on a spectrum. So while the definition of trauma for an individual at a different stage of life and for a culture, both are different. And I think we potentially speak to both simultaneously.
Yeah. So, I mean, the point about the flux kind of brought up this, I mean, one of the dialogues that we were in, that if I'm not able to experience and name any of these, then I'm not able to have compassion when somebody else from that is talking. They become the other in that moment, right? And I might come from advising, maybe, etc., etc. Like there's not really connection from a felt sense. So that therefore experiencing this for oneself was like very, very useful. And the other was this thing that Preeti, you're talking about, trauma. I mean, in this moment, and I'm not even I'm articulating as I'm thinking. So so trauma lies, it lies to us about things that are in front of us by making up things about this happened there, and therefore this is what it is happening, and how therefore it goes in the face of truth, and therefore anything that we are looking at truth, the trauma must be, because the trauma talks back, right? And we hear the trauma. We're not really looking for truth, therefore there is the shield that then happens. Yeah.
So what
I
I'm
just,
hearing is, Hari, you were saying something?
no, when Ria was speaking, I just remembered this instance in one of our dialogues where it just stood out to me what, um, how I was holding this entire idea of healing. And I think we had a very insightful session that day where there's a lot of clarity between what is just venting the pain versus a catharsis versus actual healing. And what I've discovered for myself was a lot of times um, the process of venting or a cathartic kind of a experience was being confused with the actual healing of that trauma. And I think that's a very powerful shift or a awareness, at least for myself.
Yeah, so I think that's where the kind of the natural next thought goes, right? So first of all, I realize it's 6,000 hours of being with something that is trauma, and having really allowed it to process itself, the good, bad, ugly, everything. It seems to have, just so much inquiry with what is seems to have happened. uh, and you've not been in a hurry to quickly take it to its healing and resolution is the sense I'm getting. So first of all, just so much appreciation from me to all of you for having undertaken 6,000 hours, because my sense is whatever we do in the microcosm will have an impact on the macrocosm. So whatever was the archetype of that trauma would also have got processed in some way, whether we understand it or not. So I'm just keeping track of time, and we have about 30 minutes more. So, really, where would you like to take us with this? Did this lead to something at some point then, where it was not just about venting, but then how did the windows of resolution or healing uh, come about? And, so welcome to take us there now.
Now, what I'll do is I'll take you through the other side also of the picture quickly, because I think that's extremely important for any healing to happen,
Yeah.
and some ways of working with it. And we've actually tried it out. We said, okay, we're ready to do a kind of a dialoguing process with this, and tried it out with a group, which has worked pretty well. And that was a group of activists. So that was a nice test. Yeah. People with very strong locations and deeply entrenched ideas of what has happened to them and what's happening to everybody else. So I think it was a good experience. Yeah. So yeah, when we're looking at this now, obviously the question then turned out to saying, are we only the colonized? And like I said before, India is a half-baked country. So many of us are also on the other side, and that's a difficult thing to own up to, right? So what do we do when we try to reclaim our Shakti? What do we do, right? And it's very, you can see this in so many ways. Now, people, the easiest thing to do is to push it out there and say, look at what the politicians are doing, how they're extracting and enslaving, and so on and so forth. But that's like pushing it out there. The reality is that I think any sensitive person in the world today has to look at their own culture and say, how are we colonizing the earth? How have we colonized other people? Most of what is called wealth in the world today has come out of colonization. So how am I part of this process? Because I am. Yeah, so we looked at that and we got the other side of this, right? So we did the same thing. We said, what is the nature of each of these spaces, right? So what happens when I start seeking power and I'm still located in shame? Yeah. So can I really look at this? Can I not look at this? What are the internal conflicts that each of us are going through? Yeah. Do we get caught with, being the human face of a very, very oppressive system? Yeah. Who am I in this space and what am I doing with myself? Right. And then we went to the other, we looked at all four. Right. So when I'm seeking power and I'm coming from a space of arrogance, I simply say, you know what, I was destined to be who I am and you're destined to be who you are, and that's it. So I'm going to find ways of dominating and extracting. And if you talk too much, I'm going to drop a bomb on you. Right. And so on. So there's a whole lot of consolidating of power and all that. And then, of course, there are some of us who are willing to listen to the voice of the victim, and from a space of owning up to the shame, from a space of saying, how do we share power? But here also, there are lots of, it's not an easy space, because people get into this whole thing of saying, you know what, and we find this quite a bit. So if I'm a Brahmin, I cannot stand up and say I'm a Brahmin with any pride. I have to see how to wipe this out of my skin and everything and become somebody else. So the whole lot of self-flagellation, there's a whole lot of collusion, the whole complex kind of thing that happens here, right? And then, of course, there's the hopeful space of saying, can I own up who I am? Can I own up where I am with dignity? And from the power and privilege I have today, I don't have to be guilty of it, because for whatever accident of birth or whatever, here I am. So how do I then share this, and how do I start working towards a space which has got equity, and so on? Yeah, so we looked at these four also quite deeply. And I think a lot of the understanding of both the traumatized part and how we're dealing with it and how we compensate for it by going over to the other side, and all that came through in the dialogue. And this is when it struck us that any person who has to own up to their community belonging today has to be willing to look at both sides. So it's no longer the difficulty of being a Hindu, but the difficulty of owning up to my community belonging, owning up to where we come from, and then being able to look at others without othering, to own up to differences clearly, to own up to the reality that we are different. We come from different histories, both personal and community histories. And how do we own up to this history?
So again, quite brilliant. And I noticed the
Little louder, Nilima.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So again, I said just fabulous. I noticed in both the charts so far, the top right-hand quadrant seems to be the most healthy of the four. Am I right?
It's the most hopeful. Yeah.
And that too carries a dysfunction.
Of course it does.
To watch out for. So
Yeah. It's so easy to pretend to be the angel who's coming there to help the people in distress, no?
Yes. So someone else was saying something when I spoke.
No, I was just about to add that when we went through this exploration, for me, what stood out was how difficult it was to even see that there's also the perpetrator in me. But so when I own up to the identity, oftentimes it's more convenient to hold on to the anger or the rage of the victim than also see in what way am I or this identity is also part of the violence. So I think there was a lot of difficulty in seeing it to begin with. And so that was, I think this kind of a group process really helped to look at it in a more meaningful way.
A couple of thoughts, not all, well, all interdependent, but not all connected. One is in these conversations, the idea of cultural misappropriation was very alive for a lot of us, for me in specific, because uh, I am a student of Hinduism, I'm a student of Vedanta, and I found something simple as no reference to APA when it comes to Vedantic texts as potentially offensive, or uh, the misrepresentation uh, of the goddesses, and or a interpretation through a limited awareness. And I'm still struggling with it because, on one level, I do agree and believe that none of this belongs only to me, and yet at the same time, it bothers me. So it's my own. I'm sitting in one of these 4 boxes as I explore and define what this specific identity of mine is as I work through this exploration. The other was to Hari's point on claiming our own victimhood as well as our perpetrator and our internal perpetrator. Because to Raghu's point earlier and your question, Lilima, it's easy to pretend, but it's hard to really reach the right top corner. Uh, it's hopeful because it defines a new doorway. It's the portal or the conduit to something that will emerge. So there's a lot of cleaning up to do before we get there.
Owning up and cleaning up.
Yes, can't clean without owning.
Now, the interesting thing, Nilima, is when people who are in power don't own up to their victimhood, they become very, very violent victimizers. And the other way about. Yeah, when the victim doesn't own up to their also being perpetrators, they have a license of being the victim, which can be terribly, terribly destructive. And I think in India today, we are seeing both. We're seeing people in privilege who don't understand how to own up to their victimhood, and they pretend as though, they were born in some other country or some other planet. But the way they victimize people is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the same way, people who have been at the receiving end, when they don't understand their own going over to the other side, they can be very violent. Yeah, and it's incredible that the fabric of India so far has been held together by some incredible abilities to dialogue, which I've seen, which I've actually experienced when I've worked with water issues on the ground and so on. But currently, it's being shaken up, right? And it's not being shaken up by the BJP; it's being shaken up by everybody. And I think part of the shakeup is simply that the more assertive certain voices become, the more violent the other side becomes, and then there's a whole lot of blame showing instead of being able to discover the space of dialogue.
I have a silly question. Maybe it's silly, but I have been, from what I'm seeing and hearing, I'm wondering what is or if there is, or how to look at it in terms of gender. Like, is this does it have anything to do, say, with, like, what is the connection, say, with patriarchy and matriarchy, and how is gender, I mean, I think you get what I'm trying to I'm trying to understand. I'm not questioning that way, but
Yeah. If I hazard an answer in this group, it's just another belonging. It's another category of belonging. And the same processes would apply.
Yeah. I mean, I maybe I can share, sort of a personal instance. I mean, not the whole story, but growing up, at one point in time in my life, I found out many years later that my sister was abused, my younger sister, and that became like a turning point in my life, and I went into this rage against men, that and became this activist feminist and did a whole bunch of stuff. Till then my son was born, and then I had to do like a U-turn. And then I had to see how, I mean, till then I didn't even recognize the perpetrator, right? But the perpetrator dressed as a victim, not to take away from that, but me doing the same thing in a different context was never going to heal anybody. Right? There was no healing in that at all. And until that point, and the turnaround for me was that to start seeing the other in me and me in the other, and to see and own up, like literally. I mean, I remember one thing I had one day, I don't know why, that I had to make a list of like 23 people I had to apologize to. And it took me like 3 years. It wasn't easy to like swallow that pride and this and that. But yeah, I mean, but I think also, this is my personal thing, that I don't think the top right corner is a destination. Not working towards that so that we've arrived. I mean, from a corporate context, I'm seeing this also from that lens, right? Generally, we put the top right corner is an aspirational corner, and from everywhere we move there. But I think it can be like the North Star, yes. But at different times, I know I've had to, as a goal, had to reach a different quadrant because I had not been able to access that inside of me. Then contextually for me, that became the place to go to. Yeah.
Somewhat like the orders of consciousness, right? What is the consciousness that we, given our varied identities, where do we sit? Where are we located right now? And that process of consolidation is possibly a lifetime process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Much as I'd love to chase it and get it done really quickly.
Yeah.
it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Yes, Neela?
First of all, I'm absolutely amazed at this incredibly deep analysis, both at the personal and collective level that your group has done. So, Nilima and some of you know that I have been a student of Tantra. And it's amazing the technologies that Indian sciences had developed for thousands of years to exactly deal with this kind of situation. So, but the methods have been lost. So think about, not lost, otherwise I wouldn't know about them. They are there, very much there. Now the colonization, I mean, we need to look at the individual situation and then we need to look at the global situation. In order to recognize the colonized self, of course, you have to get over the granthi, the knot, the pain body. Eckhart Tolle calls it pain body. So you have to be able to see the pain body and you have to be able to dissolve it. Otherwise, we cannot go beyond violence. I mean, one of my foundational texts that had influenced me tremendously was Jiddu Krishnamurti's Beyond Violence that I read in my teens. So the methods allow us to watch the anger, the hatred, the energy arise and let dissolve. Now, since you mentioned gender and all these things, energy, see, this is what has happened because of fake so-called quote unquote patriarchy, which is a very messy word, is not, we cannot look at energy, say of sexuality. Like Ria, you were saying about how this rage brought you to activism, right? But then you got over it. I mean, I have been teaching women's studies, and my first book was called In the Beginning is Desire. Until unless we look at this energy without judgment, without suppression, we cannot get over it. We cannot, because victimhood actually gives us tremendous power. Once you, I mean, I did this, I've been living in the United States for more than 30 years now with the Black Lives Matter. I have seen that even women, very powerful women, get tremendous amount of energy and power from victimhood.
Yeah.
And because that makes you self-righteous, that makes you, hey, and separate entity, right? As a separate entity, we cannot commune. Think about it, all the traditions in the world, deeply moksha is not some strange word. It is that cleansing, right? You have to cleanse yourself, untie the knots. Every tradition has it. I'm a student of Gnostic Christianity right now, and which is untying the knots that get stuck in our system. So it is only through these small, slow processes of seeing the self and dissolving the self. I mean, what's new about that? India is a master, absolute master in the methodologies that have been developed. Except that under these global events, which have given us both good things and bad things, we cannot just look at it as nothing but negative. We have to look at our own, like many of you said, as perpetrators, caste oppression, female oppression. But what is the nature of that oppression? So I very much like the notion of inquiry, right? Not just questions, inquiry. And I think this is an amazing platform where you're doing it. And I'm very happy. I'm very happy to hear this. But until unless we are ready to look at the energy, our energy bodies, and how they affect our psycho-spiritual, psychobiological, identity, we cannot get over that. And we have to create those educational moments. We have to use, which the whole world is using, by the way, our technique. I mean, Preeti was talking about appropriation and all that in different names. Those technologies are being used at the top institutions. Tantra is so well understood in its scientific mode now by people who are seriously studying it, not as some esoteric, strange sex stuff, but a foundationally powerful methodology to dissolve exactly what we are talking about, trauma resolution, and seeing that we are part of the bigger whole, and yet not dissolve the identity in some vacuous Advaita Vedanta, by the way. Very important to ground ourselves into the lived reality. The two truths are vital for us to understand. Otherwise, we cannot operate in the world. Anyway, I just wanted to chime in the dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, many of us are also studying and practicing yoga, Neela. So this whole process was obviously a dharana and a dhyana process too.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have been easy to work with, na?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's pretty obvious. Otherwise, this kind of calm ability to see wouldn't be there.
Wasn't calm when we were doing it, just to let you know.
You know, and
I'm
also,
glad.
yeah, also we haven't put that into the frame. We actually working with several levels from which you know, what are the levels from which you cannot see this? What are the levels from which you can see this? And right, that's another complication which I haven't shared today. But let me share one more complication and then we'll have a quick chat. Yeah. So after looking at all this, I'm going to skip this. Yeah. We looked at this frame too. Yeah. Where am I located when I'm asking the question about my belonging? Right. So in the Indian tradition, we have these things. Now that if you have to look at any truth, there are many frames, but this is the one frame that we used. What is the mukham? What is the face and where is the view coming from? So if you put that together, we get four spaces. Nah? One is looking inward, looking outward, being an insider, looking in, and being an outsider. Right. So these four become important also because, right, what happens when I'm looking at my belonging as an insider looking within? And what is the kind of self-reflective process that then comes in? What lenses am I using? When am I able to stay with it? When am I running away from it? How am I obfuscating it? There's so many questions that come up out here, right? But at the same time, we also have to deal with the reality that I'm looking at others too. And what's the lens through which I'm looking at others? How am I critiquing the other? And so on. And so you have these four views, right? How is the outsider looking at me? From where? What are their ulterior motives? And then there is this political mess. So if you look at it outside out, there is a whole mess where there's a political fight about identities, which I think is really boiling over across the world today. So how do we look at this? What do we do with this? Yeah, so this is another space apart from the levels of myself from which I have to look at it. So it's a multi-dimensional kind of journey. So 6,000 hours and we've just got started. But I must say, we did try this out with a small group and we were quite amazed with the amount of dialogue that did ensue. Ria and some of us were there in that group. So
Yeah.
so this is how far we've come right now.
That was a very pretty last slide, which you showed very, very briefly.
Oh, you want to see it again?
Rameshwaram, right? Or Meenakshi
Yeah,
Madhuri.
Rameshwaram.
Rameshwaram,
But,
okay.
but these are all stolen pictures. Yeah, somebody sent me these pictures, so I quickly stole some of them for this.
They bring delight, so stealing is worth it, like butter.
Oh, just such a beautiful, rich feeling I'm left with. Having soaked in the messiness, it's like the lotus sitting in its own muck. Trusting that the lotus stem somehow is emerging out of this and a bud will come and a bloom will happen. So it's brilliant. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I can't wait for to be continued parts 2, 3, 4, as many as you need. If there are any people who just want to give a quick chime in and say just literally a line, you're welcome to have the mic now. We have just a few minutes, 4 minutes. Anyone has something to comment, please do so now. Yeah. Thank you, Petra.
I would like to share, but I just see that Petra is typing exactly the same. It feels like being, I don't know, soaked in. You use the word soaked in, Nilima. I just want to say thank you, and I'm feeling very grateful for the work that you have been doing. And looking forward to what comes more. So many questions. I noticed that I start looking for the solution quickly, but I will just stay patient and see what comes more. But I can really feel the energy, what you have been doing, and feel grateful to be part of it, at least now for this 1.5 hours. And thank you, Nilima, for organizing this, and see what comes for the world. And it's, yeah, so that's what I feel, but I don't know the right words right now, so I just keep silent. Say thank you.
Thank you, Marjolein. You know, this group today is such a beautiful cross section of so many things, you know, rivers that are happening right now. So Marjolein is part of our Shakti Fellowship program, and she and another fellow called Monica have started Grandmother's March, and how we can bring that grandmother archetype and grandmothership as a way of leadership that the world needs right now. So it's all about healing and harmony and holding the whole. And you know, in addition to what Neela was describing as the technologies of Tantra that know how to dissolve the stuck trauma energy that we are holding as Hindus, I'm wondering, you know, Preeti and Raghu, if there is something in the feminine wisdom of this land and this grandmother wisdom of you know, which knows how to keep the civilization going even as it gets hacked and brutalized, and you know, there's something there as well.
We'll have to explore, no? Shakti is always there, yeah. Everything is Shakti. So
Well, it's the movement of thought and the courage to explore and the very foundation of inquiry in itself. Articulation becomes is important, but becomes the outcome. So it is Shakti.
What I heard today was interesting. You know, I heard your inquiry in this very beautiful, you know, the depth of thought with which this inquiry is taking place. And then that's almost the Vedantic view, right? The whole process of dialogue. And then what Neela brought, which is saying in this land, we also have the tantric technologies to then resolve what the thought shows up, you know, to be resolved as, you know. So I'm left with this deep hope that with the process of inquiry and dialogue in this very, very pure Vedic kind of way that seems to have emerged here. And this land also has these tantric technologies to then heal the dysfunctions that are revealed through the inquiry, and to leverage, using Preeti's words, to leverage the function for the functioning stuff as well, you know. I'm left with a lot of hope and to see where your group goes. So please come back every few months and share with us where this process is going.
Can I say
And
one more thing
yeah, go
yes,
ahead.
about this Hindu thing? So as you know, historically, the word Hindu did not exist.
I know.
Right.
I know.
So you guys are very well versed. I don't have to say that. But in order to really get to the Indic civilizational wisdom, we have to go back, never forget the Buddha. We forgot the Buddha. We appropriated the Buddha. We forgot Pragya and went after Shakti. If we don't understand the Shiva Shakti understanding of this thing. So first we have to, that all the dharmas of the land, when we use the word Sanatana, it's not just Hinduism or Vedic Hinduism, which is highly patriarchal, but all the dharmas, and most ancient, the Jainas, the Buddha. I mean, when we go, and that's the identity, not this narrow Hindu thing that has come up as a reaction to the colonizers, that kind of stuff. So I think this widening of the word in the ancient sense, it's simply the people of the, beyond the Indus, in where the term came from. So just that, I'm sure you all know that, but just thought part of the conversation.
No, but we have to, we debated this quite a bit, Neela, and then we said, let's not escape from the fact that the issue is the difficulty of being Hindu and facing up to all of this. Not running away from this middle ground that we're stuck in.
Yes, because the term is now, you can't run away from the terminology.
You can't.
Yeah.
I want to just share one line. After hearing Mariolyn, like she said, I feel very soaked. And then Nilima said she feels very hopeful. I am feeling exactly the opposite. I am feeling like, even though there is a mental, intellectual thrill, this movement of thought, but I am like, my heart feels very heavy, and I'm actually, this whole dialogue makes me feel very naked, like that's the word has come to me, that I feel absolutely naked, like, and there's like no thread to hold on to at all anymore. I don't even know what that means, but this is how I am right now. And if you're going to close like this, that's very sad.
Oh, you got it, Rashi. You just got it. See, this is the power of the feminine. Okay. This is the power that you have to own. When you feel like that, okay, the nakedness of it all. I'm a Kali worshiper.
Yeah, and
the naked reality, okay, absolute naked truth. If we don't do, I'm not saying that everybody's up to it, but that's the slow movement. So I'm so glad you said that. So glad that you said. And Poonam just mentioned about the trauma the female body keeps, and we have to see it. We have to see it, that yes, our bodies do carry that, because that sensitivity, the profound, deep sensitivity. Come to your senses. Unfortunately, we're thrown at our minds, thrown at our thoughts, and the thoughts keep us. I mean, the first thing we have to do through yoga, as all of you know, is to get out of our head. And this process did that to you, Rashi.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? That ultimately it's all a continuum. So the mind will bring you back to the body if it is done with authenticity and this incredible rawness that all of you seem to have brought to this work, Raghu, Preeti, and everybody. So thank you so much. And I just feel it's a beautiful note to just hold and close, and to be continued. And just ask everyone to go in peace, and many, many thanks, Raghu and Preeti and Neela.
Thanks, Nilima. And Rashi, please have some water. I'm a little concerned just looking at you right now. So, yeah.
Thank you. This gives.
Thanks a lot, Neelima, for having triggered us into this deep, slippery slope.
So necessary, so necessary. If this country has to rise as is prophesized, then it's so necessary. So I'm so grateful that we have people like you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have a lovely evening.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.